All right, guys. So, day two. Let's get it shopping. So, the aim is what evidence is there of evolution by natural selection? So, as we always do, as we should always do, is annotate the aim, right? So, obviously, evolution, you guys should got change over time, right? And then we also have natural selection, which the environment chooses favorable traits. All right, so evolution is a change over time, and the environment chooses favorable traits, right? Natural selection is what drives evolution. All right, so number one says, which statement is most closely related to the modern theory of evolution? By the way, I'm totally aware that the answers are already displayed on the screen. I'm still getting everything together. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but whatever. So obviously the answer is C. Organisms best adapted to a changed environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to offspring. So organisms best adapted, so we see that word adaptation, right? So that's favorable traits. Are more likely to reproduce and pass their genes on to offspring. The answer definitely could not be D, as in doggy, because asexual reproduction increases the survival of the species. Well, we know in asexual reproduction, there's only one parent, and the offspring are identical. If they're all genetically identical, is there variation? Not much variation at all, right? And we know in order for natural selection and evolution to occur, we need genetic variation. All right, so that definitely wouldn't be a part of the theory of evolution. Letter B, evolution is the result of mutations and recombination only. That's obviously not true because we spoke about the environment being a factor, being a major factor. And then letter A, characteristics that are acquired during life are passed to offspring by sexual reproduction. Not necessarily true, right? Bacteria and other asexually reproducing organisms like starfish, they do not engage in sexual reproduction, but yet they're still here on Earth. They're still able to survive because there can still be change. So not all organisms reproduce sexually, which we should already know. So the best answer is definitely letter C. All right, and then number two, the theory of biological evolution includes which concepts? All right, so the answer is A. Species of organisms found on Earth today have adaptations not always found in earlier species. What does that mean? If we take humans, like we spoke about in day one, if we take humans and the loss of so much body hair, right? They were still humans back then. They just look a lot different than we do now because the environment is also a lot different than how it is now, right? With the global increase in temperature, if the temperature is steadily increasing over time, I'll need less and less body hair to keep myself warm, all right? So keep those things in mind, all right? All right, moving on. Oops. So some key unit vocabulary words that you need to know. First one is evolution, which is a change over time. These are words that we're going to be using a lot. So please make sure, please make sure that, you know, you understand those, right? And obviously you guys are writing this in evolution day 2. I don't know why it says day 8 at the top, but it's definitely day 2. Looks like this. Okay, all right. Adaptation, inherited traits that improve the chances of survival and reproduction. Pretty straightforward. Once again, we keep seeing this survival and reproduction thing going on there. So, you know, okay, and then natural selection. Darwin, right? So Charles Darwin was the theorist of natural selection. His name is Charles Darwin. He's known as the father of evolution. Process by which organisms better adapted to the environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So again, survival and reproduction, that keeps coming up over and over again. So please get used to that. All right. All right. So who is Charles Darwin? Right? So let's see who he is, right? So he went on a voyage on the Beagle. He arrived at the famous Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Ecuador is in South America, and there's this chain of islands that are there, right? Lots and lots of islands. While he was there, he collected several species of finches. Finches are different, are a certain type of bird. And then Darwin's idea was species changed over time and gave rise to new species. So the only way that we get new species of animals or any type of organism on Earth is from a pre-existing species, which actually goes a lot in line with the cell theory that we learned back in Unit 2, right? New cells, old cells, pre-existing cells give rise to new cells. So it makes sense that pre-existing species give rise to new species over time. Okay. All right. Um, so here's the Galapagos Islands, right? Off the coast of Ecuador. All right. This is like a zoomed in version. As you can see, there's dozens of islands that are there. Um, that's where he did a lot of his exploration. Okay. Here are some of Darwin's finches that he saw. Okay, so some of the finches that he saw here was the vegetarian tree finch, right? The woodpecker finch, the sharp-beaked ground finch, the large ground finch, those type of things, right? Now, this is a really important wheel. You have to learn how to read this wheel. If you look here, this is the first thing that you're going to be looking at. Tree finches, ground finches. So this tells me where they live. Obviously, tree finches live in trees, and ground finches live on the ground. Oh boy. Um, so there are, if you had to look at the map or the diagram, the chart here, how many tree finches in total would you say that there are? Let's count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see that this all falls under the umbrella of the tree finches, right? There's 5 of them: the vegetarian tree finch, the large insectivorous tree finch, the small insectivorous tree finch, and the woodpecker finch, and the warbler finch. Okay. Now, how many ground finches are there? Let's count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so the tree finches I put in green on one half, and the ground finches I put in blue the next half. No, you do not need to memorize this. but you do need to know how to dissect this diagram. Okay, so for the ground finches, we have a cactus ground finch, a sharp-beaked ground finch, a small ground finch, a medium ground finch, and a large ground finch. Okay, now the trait that Darwin specifically honed in on with his finches were the beaks. The beaks. Here we have one, two, three, four different types of beaks that are here, right? So starting from the left, we have a parrot-like beak, right? Then we have a grasping beak. Grasping means to pick at, like, you're grasping something. A probing beak. So these beaks are specifically made and used to search for something, to dig around and to search for something. And then you have the crushing beaks, right? So if you look at their beaks, they literally have beaks that are used to crush different types of things. Does that make sense? So if we um had to choose a finch that is likely to eat a a huge seed, right, with a heavy coating, a huge seed with a heavy coating, which one would we choose? You take a look at it. Um, would I choose the vegetarian tree finch? More than likely not, because it has a parrot-like beak, and if you look at the size of the beak, it's not really well equipped to really kind of crack a large seed and eat it, right? Would I choose the small insectivorous tree finch? Well, insectivorous means that they eat insects, and a seed is not an insect, so I definitely wouldn't choose that, right? Um, would I choose the warbler finch? More than likely not. Again, very, very small beak, and it's a probing beak. You don't really need to search too hard for a seed that's very large, right? But if I look over to the crushing beaks, right? If I have a seed that's very large and very heavy with a heavy coating, obviously I'm gonna need a large beak in order to actually crack that seed open and eat the contents, right? So the one that I would choose is the large ground finch because it has a big enough beak and it has a crushing beak to actually crush the seed so we can eat it. Make sense? Exactly. All right. So we'll get more in depth on this, but bear with me. All right. So different adaptations. So if you look closely up here, right, we have two different pictures. Some people may see a tree here, right? And then some people might see an owl. As you can see, the owl's eyes open, right? That's an adaptation. What kind of adaptation is that, right? If you said camouflage, good job, right? But how does camouflage work as an adaptation? Well, as you can see, if the owl looks a lot like the tree, then it can definitely hide from any predators that it may have, or it won't be bothered as much because whatever animal is passing by is just going to think that, excuse me, it's just going to think that it's a tree, right? As opposed to an owl. So camouflage is actually really, 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 really important, right? If you ever wonder why they kind of call camouflage clothes like a camo pants and things like that, the two main colors that they use for camouflage and that type of style is brown and green. Why would they use brown and green? Well, if I'm going to go fight somewhere and I want to use a guerrilla warfare tactic where I'm able to blend in, I know that trees are brown and green, and therefore it's a lot less likely for me to be found if I'm wearing camo, as opposed to a neon crop top sweater, right? Which sticks out like a sore thumb. That's not going to help me adapt to the environment that I'm actually in. Okay. Um, and then there are adaptations like social adaptations, which are here, right? Those of you that probably don't know this, but ants are the most abundant insects on Earth by far, right? And we know that they're extremely, extremely, extremely social and very, very strong as well. So one ant probably won't bother too many people or anything like that. It's not very intimidating. But millions of ants, there's safety in numbers, right? So they travel in that type of pack. That's an adaptation that helps them to survive and reproduce, right? All right, let's clear this and move on. So part B, it says describe what is happening in figures 1 through 3, right? So if you look at figure 1, right, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 white. I'll put 4W for 4 white mice. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 black mice. Simple, right? 8 mice in total. 4 white and 4 black. Now, if we look at figure 2, all right, we see that there's a predator in the form of a bird, obviously. And there are, as a result of this predator, let's count how many white mice there are. There's 1, 2, 3. Let's count how many black there are. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we can already see that which one's at a disadvantage, which one has the least favorable trait here. The white mice, because they're obviously being hunted. The black mice are not being hunted. We still have the same amount, right? And if you actually look really closely, a student of mine last year actually pointed this out to me. I didn't notice this. If you look pretty closely right here, you can see one of those white mice from the first part of the diagram and the grasp of the feet of the bird. Isn't that cool? Right? So the bird was actually able to spot it. And that fourth mouse, the fourth white mouse, had actually been picked up by the bird, right? So it was able to see it and capture it because it's not camouflaging, if you will. Therefore, it doesn't have the favorable adaptations. So obviously that white mouse is going to be eaten. If it's eaten, can it survive and reproduce? No, it cannot. Can it pass on its traits? No, it cannot. Therefore, it has the least favorable traits for that environment, right? Now, if we look at number 3, let's count how many over time, how many white mice there are. I only spot 1, so there's 1 white mouse. How many black mice are there? 1, 2, 3, 4. Still 4. So does this represent evolution? Yes, right? Because is this a change over time? Yes, this is a change over time. What's changing? The population is changing over time. It's going from white to black to more black to almost exclusively black. But as you can see, due to genetic variation, there will always still be at least a few white mice next to a few black mice. But all of the black mice were able to survive. Therefore, they have a higher chance of reproducing and passing on the black coat fur gene to its offspring so that they can also survive and reproduce. That white mouse may pass on some of their genes, or it may not. But it is possible for it to pass on. It's just highly improbable that it will. All right. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right. So the black mouse has adaptations, the favorable traits, not favorable for the white mouse. Okay. Okay. All right. Moving on. Whoops. Now, is the population of mice different in figure 3 than in figure 1? Explain why. Well, we just went over the entire diagram, right? So um, if you look at figure 3, there's more black mice than there are white mice, right? And that's because the white mice did not have the favorable traits, and therefore most of them were killed and eaten by the birds, whereas the black mice had the adaptations in order to survive, and eventually they'll be able to reproduce. Okay. Living things that are well adapted to their environment survive and reproduce. Man, they just keep coming up with survive and reproduce. Super important. Those that are not well adapted don't survive and reproduce, obviously. An adaptation is any characteristic that increases fitness, which is the ability to survive and reproduce. What characteristic of the mice is an adaptation that increased their fitness, right? So what was the trait or the adaptation that increased their fitness, everyone? Their fur color, right? Their fur color is the reason that they were able to survive and reproduce because they were able to blend in. All right. The table below gives descriptions of 4 female mice that live in a beach area. So they live in a beach area, which is mostly tan sand with scattered plants. According to the definition given for fitness, which mouse would biologists consider the fittest? Explain why this mouse would be the fittest. So let's dissect this, right? We have the color of their fur, which are 4 different colors, right? We have black, tan, tan and black, and cream, right? Now, what do we know about a beach area? The sand tends to be very tan. Keep that in mind, right? The sand tends to be very tan, and obviously there's sand at the beach, right? Now, the age at death, right, for the black mouse is 2 months. So they only live 2 months. The tan mice lived 8 months. Pretty long time. The tan and black ones lived 4 months. And then the cream ones lived 2 months. Right? So just kind of even based on that alone, we can start to gauge which mouse might be more fittest based off of the age at which they died, right? Obviously, the longer that an organism lives, the closer to reproductive age it has, and the increases the chances of them actually reproducing and carrying on, right? And producing offspring. And then the number of pups produced by each female. So the number of pups produced by each female for the black was 0. They didn't even reproduce. And it's probably because they died at 2 months, right? They didn't reach reproductive age because they probably weren't able to survive that well. The number of pups for tan was 11. It's a pretty good amount of offspring to come out of like one mouse, right? Then for tan and black is 3. Not bad, but not the best either, right? And then for cream was 0. So they didn't seem to be able to survive and reproduce, much like the black mouse, right? Which also lived 2 months and produced no pups. Okay. Now the running speed for the black mouse is 8 centimeters a second, right? Not too shabby. For the tan mouse is 6 centimeters a second. Tan and black, 7 centimeters a second. And then cream was the slowest with 5 centimeters a second, right? So the question says, which mouse would biologists consider to be the fittest? Explain why this mouse would be the fittest. So based off of what we just kind of annotated, right? The age at death part has to do with survival. The number of pups produced have to do with reproduction. Those are the only 2 things we care about in this unit: survive and reproduce. That's it. So the running speed, that information doesn't even matter. Literally does not matter. What's important is that they're able to survive and reproduce and pass on those traits. Okay? So to answer the question, you guys should have seen that the tan mouse was clearly the most fit, right? They lived the longest and they reproduce the most amount of offspring. That makes them the most fit, right? Now, they probably don't run the fastest, but here, that doesn't really matter, all right? Now, if we look at the next question, it says, if a mouse's fur color is generally similar to its mother's color, what color fur would be most common among the pups? Well, which color was able to be passed on abundantly to the most amount of pups? That would be tan, right? Because they produce 11 tan mice. Cream didn't produce any, black didn't produce any, and tan and black only produced 3, right? So essentially, it would be tan because the mother that's giving birth to all these mice, their offspring have similar fur colors. So if the mother is tan, it's likely that those pups are going to be tan as well. Hopefully that makes sense. But there is one thing that I do want to say here, and this kind of goes back to traits, right? Even though we're not looking at running speed here, it's important for us to kind of note that the black mouse ran 8 centimeters a second, okay? But the tan mouse ran 6 centimeters a second. Now, if the tan mouse is most fit, one would assume like, oh, they probably run the fastest, they're the strongest, they're the best, right? But that's not the case here. Why would a black mouse that lives on the beach have to run slightly faster than its other counterparts here? The reason is because they're probably the most hunted, right? Which is why they don't live that long and they didn't reproduce any pups because they're being hunted. Because obviously, I can see a black mouse running on a tan background, which is the sand, right? So, over time, they've adapted to running much more faster. If I can run much more faster, right, then it's a possibility that I can actually outrun whatever is stalking me or preying me or something like that. If I can outrun them, then that increases my likelihood of surviving. If I increase my likelihood of surviving, that increases my likelihood of reproducing and passing on those genes. So the black mice in the population that ran 4 centimeters a second, they're definitely going to die, right? But the ones that run 8 centimeters a second, or 9 centimeters a second, or 10 centimeters, there's a slight chance that they'll be able to reach reproductive age and actually pass those genes on over time. Does that make sense? Right? Variations, all these variations within. All right. Great job, guys. You guys are killing it. All right. Can I move on? I'm moving on anyway. All right. So part C, coming up on part C. So as I am reading, you all are annotating. A characteristic which is influenced by genes and passed from parents to offspring is called heritable. Right? So a characteristic which is influenced by genes and passed on is called heritable traits, right? We hear the word inherited in there. Over many generations, heritable adaptive characteristics become more common in a population. Heritable characteristics become more common in a population. This is called evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection takes place over many, many generations, right? So just because I have favorable traits doesn't mean that like my offspring or my kids in the future are necessarily going to have all the traits that I have just because I passed on some of them. Okay. Evolution by natural selection leads to adaptation within a population. So evolution by natural selection, adaptation within a population. The term evolution by natural selection does not refer to individuals changing, only to changes in the frequency of adaptive characteristics in a population as a whole. Let's see what that actually looks like. For example, the mice that lived in the beach area with tan sand, none of the mice had a change in the color of their fur. However, due to natural selection, tan fur was more common for the pups than for the mother mice. All right. In summary, a heritable characteristic that helps an animal or plant to have more offspring, which survive to reproduce, will tend to become more common in population as a result of evolution by natural selection. All right. So when we're talking about natural selection evolution, we're talking about the population of the organism as opposed to the individual. We're talking about population. So we're talking about the vast majority of them, right? So when we're talking about human evolution, we're not just talking about Sir Sterling or Miss Ivory individually or Miss Parsons individually or Miss Collins individually. We're talking about the entire population of humans in a given area over time. Some of us are going to have it, the traits, the adaptations, the favorable traits. Some of us are simply not going to have the favorable traits over time. Okay? All right, stop and jot. Explain why a characteristic which helps an animal to live longer will generally tend to become more common in the population as a result of evolution by natural selection. So we have different characteristics that help animals live longer, right? Whether it's agility, speed, ability to feast on different food sources, space, different things like that, their ability to hunt or to camouflage, all of those things can influence an animal's survival and reproductive techniques, right? But why would any characteristic that helps an animal live longer tend to become the norm in the population? The entire point of organisms, what they try to do is to survive and reproduce. In order for them to survive and reproduce, they must have the favorable characteristics, aka the adaptations needed in order to do so. Does that make sense, guys? Like, hopefully that's making sense to you, right? So, over time, over like, let's say 100 generations, right? If we become more exposed to the sun, right? Those that have more melanin in their skin are less likely to develop skin cancers or die from skin cancers or get like terribly sunburned or have mutations that are not favorable in the DNA of their skin cells and things of that nature. They're much more likely to survive and reproduce. The darkest people with darker complexions are more likely to survive and reproduce because their body already has the traits needed to absorb increasing amounts of sunlight. Whereas somebody that's a lot more lighter are a lot less likely to be able to survive that kind of environment. So over time, darker tones are going to be able to be passed on because those are the people that are surviving and reproducing. That's just like how it is, right? It doesn't mean that darker tone skin is better than lighter tone skin or lighter tone skin is better than darker tone skin. We don't use the term better. We just use the term more fit for that environment that's there, if that makes sense. Okay. So again, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, anything that you might be confused on, please reach out to any of us for living environment teachers. We'll be happy to help you. Hopefully these recordings are helping you guys. I'm trying to keep it how we normally would have it in class and everything of that nature. As you can see, I'm using the PowerPoint this time, so I've been fidgeting around with some things to help you guys out. But yeah, until next time, aka until tomorrow. Bye, guys.